I was recounting of how when I was working at Richard Rogers, his kind of first rule of architecture was win the job. Because without the job, without the client, there is no architecture.
Episode 128.
This is The Business of Architecture.
Welcome back, Architect Nation. This is the show where you'll discover tips, strategies, and secrets for running a profitable and impactful architecture practice. If you believe that it's possible to make money and do good, then this is the show for you. If you aren't already on the Business of Architecture email list, make sure you claim your free account on businessafarchitecture.com by clicking the green Join Today button. I'm your host, Enoch Sears. Today's show is sponsored by BQE Software, the makers of ArchiOffice. ArchiOffice is the office and project management software built with the needs of architects in mind. And for a limited time, startup firms can get 2 free seats of ArchiOffice for a year. Go check it out at archioffice.com. Now, there's one other thing I want to let you know about. If you listen to podcasts, make sure you go subscribe to ArchiSpeak. You can find it on iTunes or visit archispeakpodcast.com. ArchiSpeak is a casual conversation about all things architecture. Super entertaining podcast with a healthy dose of humor by my 3 friends, Cormac Phelan, Neil Penn, and Evan Troxel. When you head on over there, let them know you heard about it on Business of Architecture. Today's guest has an illustrious past, graduating from Cambridge University and the Bartlett School of Architecture. He's worked in the offices of world-renowned firms Grimshaw Architects and Richard Rogers in the UK. Ryan Willard is the director of the Thinking Hand Studio. Ryan reached out to me a few weeks ago with the idea of interviewing UK architects for the Business of Architecture, and I thought that was a great idea to get some fresh perspective here on the BOA show. And I think you'll really like what we have in store here. So Ryan is going to interview architects in the UK, and then we will be working those into the normal interview lineup here on BOA. So I think, once again, I think you're really going to like the variety and the perspective that Ryan is going to bring to the show. The Business of Architecture is much more than just my effort here in the podcast. This is a worldwide movement of heightening the awareness of the importance of business skills for architects around the world, and educating the public about the value of architects and bringing the power back into the hands of architects to shape our cities, to shape our homes, to shape the places where we live and work. So you are a part of this, and this is your platform. So like Ryan, if you would like to contribute and you know that you have a message and you'd like to do some interviews or you have some content that you want to share with the world to contribute to this dialogue, just drop a note to me at enoch@businessafarchitecture.com. The following interview that you'll hear today is an informal conversation I had with Ryan, but it went so well that I thought you'd want to hear a little bit behind the scenes of what happens at Business of Architecture. So in this episode, Ryan and I discuss the weather in England, networking, how to target and find high-end clients who aren't shocked by expensive fees, selling architecture, and a lot more. So for our listeners, I'm talking with Ryan Willard, based out of the UK. He's the owner of the Thinking Hand Studio, and we're just chatting because we may be working Ryan into the lineup of Business of Architecture as an interviewer. So this is basically this episode. I want to introduce Ryan to all of you guys, and let me know if you like him or not. Would you like to see Ryan interviewing some of the UK architects and European architects and thought leaders? I'm sure everyone's going to say yes.
Excellent. No, I'm very happy to be here talking with you. It's very exciting.
So let's just talk about, we don't really know what exactly is going to happen, Ryan, in terms of how the interviews are going to work out and how they're going to kind of work in the Business of Architecture podcast. But what we'll start out doing is we'll, as you record your interviews, we'll kind of slot those in. So some of the podcast interviews you're going to hear Ryan talking and not me. And I think it's really going to add a lot to the conversation. It's going to take the focus off of Enoch, because it's not just about me, it's about all of us architects. And so it's going to be really good to have Ryan on the show. Ryan's going to be good to have you. And then also to get that more international perspective, because I know that although I do have a lot of UK listeners, a lot of the times the things that are happening in the States with some of my guests aren't really relevant, and they think, things are a little bit different over here. So it'll be really good to figure out how that does with the old world.
It's very interesting as well that the attitude in America towards business is you guys are less ashamed of selling stuff. It's kind of more in your culture, it's more in your nature. And the British were very reserved, and particularly in professional circles, particularly architects, were very kind of like, oh, I don't want to sell anything. Certainly not. No, we're not going to do that. Whereas in America, I'm always, I love it. I love the directness of conversation, and that business is more naturally interwoven with creative fields. I'm sure it's not all totally idyllic, and this is my kind of rose-tinted glasses, but there's certainly the kind of the culture in the States is something which, personally for me, I've always admired. That kind of salesmanship is a little bit more prevalent in creative industries.
Well, that's really interesting because the U.S. we have obviously a very strong heritage that goes back to the U.K. We still, my personal ancestors came from there. Of course, United States is a mixing pot. We have influences from all over the world, which is great. But at the same time, it's interesting to look at, and I was talking with another architect the other day about this. You have the UK, you have the United States, and then you have Australia. So it's like, the UK has a much longer history than we do in terms of Anglo-Saxon law. You look at Australia, they're a much newer nation than we are.
Yeah.
And so you go to Australia, and I was talking with this guy, Ryan King, who I may be having on the show sometime, but he was talking about how in Australia, the architecture firms are very much more kind of aggressive, very much more less traditional and more progressive. We were kind of talking about how you go to their websites and you look at the pictures of the principals and no one's smiling. All the pictures are black and white. They're just very cutting edge, very artsy.
Very serious.
Yeah. And a lot of smaller firms. So, here in the States, we do have mid-sized firms. We do have large firms. But over there in Australia, they seem to be much more about, being really scrappy, entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because, of course, in the UK, my impression is that the entrepreneurial scene over there, and like you said, the business scene is much more reserved, more conservative, and the less so in the United States, and then even less so in Australia.
Yeah. I think that's a kind of, as a generalization, there's definitely a sense of that the British were a little bit cautious when it comes to selling, and even if anything kind of slightly, you'll hear it often in conversation. If anything kind of, people will say, oh, that's a bit American, or it's a kind of, as it being a bit sort of brash in its approach, or a bit kind of salesy. But I think that's to our own detriment, really. And I think one of the things that I've gotten from running my own practice is understanding that actually I'm a salesperson first in a lot of ways. I'm in the business of architecture, like you're like the name of your show, and that's my principal job is to sell my services, is to sell architecture, and then we can go into all the lovely design philosophies and ethos and all the stuff that we've trained to develop. When we were speaking last time, I was recounting of how when I was working at Richard Rogers, his kind of first rule of architecture was win the job, because without the job, without the client, there is no architecture. Obviously, there is the world of you can be your own client, or you can go off into the kind of more academic world where you're just doing purely conceptual ideas. But that's a different strain of architecture in the world. In a way, it's part of it's part of the sphere. But generally, win the job, and that's when we can start practicing.
Well, that's a pretty awesome realization. Interestingly enough, over here in the United States, we still, if you look at business in general, sure, a lot of businesses are very business focused and they realize it's their job to sell. There's a lot of great entrepreneurial stuff going on here in the U.S. However, with architects, I would say that that's generally not the case. And so if you have a spectrum of people who like to, who are really salesy, so to speak, in terms of their professions and their jobs, on one extreme, you might have the used car salesman who's out there just trying to pressure everyone into buying and just makes everyone feel sleazy and dirty. On one extreme, right? On the other extreme, you have, the socialites who wouldn't dare even mention the word marketing or sales. in what they're doing. I think that, definitely over here, architects are much more towards the non-selling side of the spectrum. We like to see ourselves as sort of like you described as they do in the UK. Yeah,
no, exactly. And the sort of the art of selling architectural services is not one of kind of crass advertising or being quite like that. It is very much one of positioning yourself as an expert. And one of educating people and kind of indirectly, just in your being, your expertise, your knowledge, and being able to share that with people, that's the kind of indirect way of gently grooming clients in a way.
Yeah, and I think you hit it right on the head when your description of forming those relationships, when you gave the example of talking to the tailor, how it takes multiple times. I mean, you're building a real relationship there, and that's really how, if you're an architect, that's how you're going to get your best work.
Yeah, exactly. And the this idea of selling is really it's the relationship. It is based on those human relationships, and you being genuinely interested in the other person. What can I do for you? Who are you? What's making you tick? A genuine interest. And being able to extract that and communicate it, and then you become an asset. There's a relationship there, there's a trust there, which means that paves the way for a collaboration. And when that relationship is kind of intact, and there's a strong foundation there, there's an intimacy that begins to blossom between you and the clients, and you can start to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more, the design starts to happen more naturally rather than just a kind of more of a black and white service industry where, client asks you for A and you give them A, or, you give them A but a little bit of A plus as such. But when there's that, the more the relationship is there, the more different directions can happen, and the more that it becomes a collaborative effort.
You're very eloquent, Ryan. You may displace me as the Business of Architecture host here. The next Charlie Rose.
Thank you.
So, hey, Ryan, just let us know. Tell our listeners a little bit about your background, a little bit about who you are, so they have some frame of reference.
Sure. So I'm an architect. I've studied in London my entire sort of architectural career. I started studying about 2000, and I studied at the Bartlett, which is one of London's top schools, and I'm very it was the most phenomenal experience and quite transformational, really, and just understanding what architecture is. I was at the school recently for the end of year show, and it just brings back this incredible energy of people speculating, playing up with ideas. What is architecture? What does it mean to be an architect in contemporary society? So that kind of education it kind of ripped my brain open and put a whole lot of new stuff into it. And actually now, running my own business, that kind of creative, fertile, almost avant-garde environment is incredibly good for entrepreneurial thinking. This kind of holistic, systemic way that we look at the world as an architect and kind of go into free flow and be very creative is ideal for business. It's ideal for making those kind of links with networks and stuff. So I spent 8 years, whatever it was, studying at the Bartlett, did all my professional qualifications at Cambridge University. And, in the UK, when we sort of halfway after you've done your sort of bachelor's, as it were, I went and worked for an architect called Peter Barbers, and he does a lot of very civic conscious projects, working on homeless hostels, social housing, and he had a very, very sort of beautiful understanding of this reciprocal nature between people and the city, and how a kind of people are informed by their building, and they then go on to inform and create the buildings, and it's this kind of circular relationship. So I was very lucky to do that, and then went back to the Bartlett, did professional examinations, got qualified, and then started working at Grimshaw, who did the Eden project, and they did lots of airport stuff, and I was working on airports mainly, which is kind of after being in the Bartlett, where you're kind of doing very avant-garde, crazy conceptual thinking to go thrown straight into the hard logistical world of airport planning and working out luggage racks and all this kind of stuff was really, I mean, it was fascinating in one sense. It was very difficult, but it was also, it's given me a very good background now in, you know, understanding the art of the diagram, in being very good at working with logistical problems and having a very strict methodology for being able to approach any problem, which was just kind of underpins all of that kind of creative thinking that you were that was being nurtured through university. So after Grimshaw, I went to work for Richard Rogers and was there for about 3 years, and primarily was working on, again, a kind of innovative housing system where we were using pre-manufactured SIPS panels to produce sort of housing solutions across East London, and, you know, build these kind of almost like flat pack housing, essentially. So it was doing a lot of that kind of housing. There's a lot of competition work that I worked on, so doing all that kind of stuff. And I was also involved in other sort of larger scale logistical projects like a whiskey distillery and those kinds of things. So it was a very large scale of work. And I found Richard Rogers was one of these environments where it's kind of like an architect's dream in a lot of ways. They treat you amazingly well. You're fed well. They take you on holiday. Richard Rogers is kind of a very inspiring leader. He's one of these guys that he's not kind of kept away from the rest of the architectural team. He's there on the floor. He comes and sits down next to you and kind of goes, right, what are you looking at? What are you doing? And very enrolling leader. So when he kind of says, why don't you try this or do that? You're like, yeah, let's go and do that. And I loved the way that he orchestrated his entire office. I thought it was wonderful. And he really was. He was like a conductor. And he was, in his very sort of social nature, and his all, the architecture that he provides is all about creating social spaces, creating places for people to meet each other. Very similar to that, what I was talking about with Peter Barber, that reciprocal relationship. And that's the way he ran his practice. Very, very sort of a charismatic, very human leader in that aspect. And obviously the way that the company is set up, it's set up like a charity, and they kind of match a lot of the profits that they make, and they make these donations. And next door to his practice, he has a restaurant called which is a Michelin-star restaurant, where obviously lots of their clients go and get wined and dined, and it's a fantastic arena for making new connections and talking to new clients. And again, just sort of watching this kind of wonderful process of new people being introduced to other people, this kind of leadership style, and the entire environment that was set up at Rogers that was very, very inspiring. And it was one of these places where you're kind of like, you're either going to stay there for the rest of your life or not. And for one reason or another, I ended up moving on, and was kind of like, I want to have more client control. I want to be able to meet the clients and deal with people myself. So as a young architect there, it's a very top heavy place. And I think, I was itching to meet clients and kind of, rather than be placed onto one aspect of a job, actually have more control and actually be able to see more of the process and be involved in the business of architecture, being involved in the winning of the work. And I think at those kind of firms, to get that kind of experience it takes its time. So after working at Rogers, I made the decision and set up practice by myself. I had a little bit of savings, which quickly evaporated way faster than I could possibly have imagined, and decided to, basically just whatever kind of work would come my way was my first sort of reaction to it. And I did a little bit of freelancing here and there, and I was helping another architect, a friend of mine called Simon Hallion, who runs Shared Architecture, and he was amazing. He was like one of my sort of mentors, and he helped me. I mean, he's been running his business for about 7-8 years. And I kind of was able to sit down with him and have long lunches, and him basically just detail everything that he's been doing and his processes, and the way that he's been winning work. And he was able to sort of pass little jobs on to me, and I was in a shared studio place with him and another architect, and so I was getting lots of my first gigs from basically bits of work that they didn't want, and friends and family were all helping me out, and but it gets to a stage where you realise that's not going to last too long. And one of my first sort of ways of realising I need a proper pipeline, how do we begin to build this? And just because I like networking, I like meeting people, I'm quite a sociable person. I think my dad suggested to me to go and try out B&I. So that was really one of the most kind of important business decisions that I've made, was to go to my local chapter. As we were discussing earlier, it's quite lucky because I live in Liverpool Street, the heart of the financial district. So I went along there, became a member, and that really was very inspiring because, again, I was surrounded by all sorts of very experienced business people. There's a guy there called Paul Roger who has his own graphic design agency, which has been running for 30 years. There's an insurance broker there, Andrew Thompson, who's had his company for 5 years. And just hearing these stories of how these businesses had grown and how they'd won clients, and the strategies that they had in place, and also just having a team of other professionals, lawyers, to IFAs, accountants, and being able to ask questions in that weekly environment was such a relief, actually. It was such a relief. And it felt kind of like a little surrogate office in a way, rather than, as you know, being a sort of sole practitioner it's pretty lonely at times. And you kind of need that. You need somebody else who's been through it just to sort of touch base with and get a feel for. So through using the B&I structure and understanding the network, that's kind of been one of my main sort of directions in how to grow my own business, is building those relationships and getting much more specific and having strategies for networking. And obviously just kind of thinking back to how Richard Rogers was doing it, and seeing that quite wonderful environment with this relationship with the River Cafe restaurant and his office, and the architecture itself lending itself to social spaces, always having breakout areas for people to talk, and having that kind of company culture, which was very much about conversation. I was kind of very influenced by that, and that's very much the sort of root of what the Thinking Hand Studio is about.
You know, here in the U.S., Ryan, a lot of architects, especially sole practitioners, at times feel squeezed on their fees if they're working with clients that aren't used to working with architects. So, especially in the residential space, if you have clients come in and they have a vision of what they want, they've never worked with an architect before, and they don't have really a clear picture of how much it costs to hire an architect. And so what ends up happening, sort of couple that with the antitrust lawsuit that the AIA went through back in I think it was the 60s, people are very cautious about fees, sharing fees, and it's resulted in what I would say is sort of like a race to the bottom. A lot of architects feel pressured to lower their fees, otherwise they'll lose out on a job. I was reading an email the other day from an architect writing to me saying, I'm desperate here. I have like 3 clients that have beat me down to like 1% of construction cost. I'm losing money on these projects. I'm curious, one of the things that makes it necessary to use an architect in the U.S. is that we do require a stamp for a certain building of a certain size. Now, for most residential projects, a stamp isn't required. So in your case, if you were going to be doing, a custom residence, you probably would not need to work with a registered architect depending on what state you're in.
Right.
So there's that. But do you find that similar kind of price pressure in the UK in terms of,
Yeah.
Certain people that will just cut their fees to try to get the job?
Yes, yes. I mean, it's particularly at the lower end of the market, it's very, very competitive. As architects, we're competing with the kind of all-in-one contractors that can bash out, building regs drawings in a week, and they can charge a third of what it is that you're charging. And from a client perspective, they don't really know what the difference is between your services and a contractor's. Lowering and reducing fees to kind of win a job. And actually, again, through BNI, I was introduced to a business coach I've done a lot of sort of. There was also whilst I sort of set up practice, there was this whole sort of world of personal development that I was doing at the same time, and I got introduced to a guy called Johan Taft, who has actually worked with me on this very matter about reducing your fees, and basically, no, don't do it. We have our fees set at a certain rate. The kind of service that you're able to bring to a client. The value that you can bring as an architect. It's a long-term investment. You're not just providing a black and white service. This is an investment for the future, which will make the client money. And you've got to be confident in being able to say that. And a lot of the work that I've been doing with Johan actually was around that area, and also the kind of head trash that goes on that we might pick up from university, we pick up in the architectural industry. There's a lot of sort of head trash stories that run around about, there's a belief in the architectural industry that it's hard to make money, and that architects don't get paid well. And if you've got that running in your head, that's what's going to happen. You're just going to live into that all the time, and it just undermines what it is that we do. And it means that when a client starts to push for lower fees, that we will do it. We will lower our fees. So one of the things I've been doing with Johan, when I first speak with a client, when I first meet a client, I'm very upfront about my fees being expensive. And if that's going to be a problem, then it's quite all right for us to not continue the conversation. And it's as upfront as that. It's very, very straightforward. But also, you getting in the position of you screen your client, because if a client suddenly comes to you and the first thing they say is, how much is it going to cost to do this? This is not a good way to start a conversation in the first place. So you having your own set of screening criteria for clients, that you're looking for that relationship. You're looking for somebody who you can get to know intimately, that you can enjoy being around, that you can go to their house and have a cup of coffee with them and enjoy talking, and they respect and understand what it is that you do as an architect, and they see you as an expert. They don't see you as just somebody who's just doing some drawings for them, just to draw up their ideas. Draw up ideas. It's a very valuable investment for how people are going to live their lives in these buildings. And again, it goes back to that relationship I was talking about, the reciprocal relationship between buildings and people, and how that works. And coming from a place where that's inside of you, and you recognize it's one of these very, very deep human activities, is making buildings, and it's not something that there's a lot of care, a lot of thought, and a lot of sacrifice as an architect to kind of go through the process to be able to do it. And we love what we do. We love it. It's so fulfilling, such a fulfilling activity to be involved in. And that's massive value for a client, and you want to take a client on that journey, and for them to see that that's the service that we're providing. It's not just a quick, do a few drawings, get it through planning, and whip something up as fast as possible. There's a different story told. So, and again, a lot, like I was saying, I've been doing with Johan in terms of the mindset and the mental stuff, the head trash and the stories. Has been really, really important in in kind of unpicking that and all the sort of things, the neurosis that you might pick up from university. Because as an architect, we are trained to work long hours into the night, and there is this kind of hard graft about it. Now, that's not going to go away as such, but there's a mindset that accompanies that of, you've got to energy and effort into it. And there's a kind of a little bit of a victim sob story that goes with it at university. And most of us, through university, when you're doing these kind of long hours, it's often, it's not very productive, it's very stressful. And, those kind of bad working habits can come through into practice, and you see lots of offices that have that kind of culture. And it's not particularly useful for anybody. And if you take that into professional working life, there's a story going on that's accompanying that, and that kind of feeds into, I'm going to lower my fees just because a client's upset.
It happens all too often.
Yeah.
All too often.
How are we doing with the signal, by the way? Your break, is it clear?
There have been a couple pauses in terms of kind of breakups. Hopefully our listeners won't mind. I mean, but I think we're getting pretty good bandwidth. It's just it pauses every now and then. But let's finish up, Ryan. Let me know, what do you have in mind for the interviews and for the future.
So I'm looking to talk with a number of different architects, mainly based in London. I've been approaching a number of different people. I want to talk to lots of new practices, new design practices. So lots of my contemporaries who have started up practices. I've got a friend, Azad Khan, who I'd like for him to share his story. I went to university with him. We were in the same unit together, and he started up business straight out of university. I mean, he barely finished. And last year, or this year actually, he was in the shortlist, the final 6 for the new Guggenheim Museum in Helsinki, which is, it's phenomenal, brilliant, absolutely wonderful mark. And there's lots of other kind of, design, young design practices like that, maybe been around 5-6 years, to new practices that have just started up, to more mature London-based architects. I'd love to have a chat with Richard Rogers and for him to. So we'll see if we can get that to happen. That would be fantastic. And I've been approaching other architects to get kind of just to hear the stories of how they've grown their businesses from inception right through to the success. And I've also wanted to chat with some other architectural service providers. So I have a friend who works for Cairo Communications, which it's a PR company for architects, and they cater for a very niche sort of area of PR, which is just dealing with architects. So I think having a conversation with him will be incredibly insightful around how it's a very complex service that we provide, and how do architects make themselves unique in such a kind of competitive market.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, Ryan.
Excellent, so am I. It should be very, very, very exciting.
And that's a wrap for another show about the business of architecture. To get more resources about how you, as an architect, can run a rewarding business that is both fun, flexible, and profitable, visit businessafarchitecture.com and click the Join button to claim your free account to Business of Architecture Insider. As a member, you'll have access to free tools and resources to help you get more clients, start a new firm, and much more. You'll also get access to my book, Social Media for Architects, where you'll learn how to use internet tools for fun and for profit. Until next week, this has been The Business of Architecture.
Everybody knows that you just gotta do it anyway.
The views expressed on the show by my guests do not represent those of the host, and I make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help you conquer the world. Bump music credit to Ben Folds 5, Do It Anyway.